The Pacific Ocean does not present itself as hostile at first. From a distance, it can look flat and calm, a surface of moving blue that reflects light and hides depth. But the scale is difficult to understand until a person is inside it, surrounded by it, with no shoreline in sight. The Pacific is the largest body of water on Earth. Its distances are measured in weeks and months rather than miles. The air above it shifts constantly, shaped by currents and weather systems that move without warning. Winds can arrive from open space with nothing to slow them. Storms can build far away and still reach a small boat days later. In the central and eastern Pacific, the ocean's movement is not random. It is guided by major currents that circle like slow rivers. The north equatorial current pushes westward. The equatorial countercurrent moves back to the east. Between them, floating debris and drifting vessels can be carried for long periods, following routes that no person can control without an engine or sail. In such water, a small fishing boat becomes insignificant. It is reduced to an object, moving with the surface, exposed to sun during the day and cold wind at night. Navigation becomes meaningless once the horizon stops changing. This is the setting in which José Salvador Alvarenga would spend more than a year at sea, carried across thousands of miles of ocean, out of sight of land, and beyond the range of ordinary rescue. José Salvador Alvarenga was born in El Salvador, in a region where coastal work and fishing were familiar parts of daily life. By adulthood, he had migrated south, eventually settling in Costa Rica. Like many men in Central America who work near the sea, his employment was shaped less by formal training and more by practical experience. Fishing was not an adventure or a personal challenge. It was labor, done for money, done repeatedly, and done in conditions that could change without notice. By 2012, Alvarenga was living in Costa Rica and working as a fisherman. Reports later described him as physically strong, accustomed to long hours on the water, and experienced in catching fish with hand lines. This kind of fishing does not rely on large commercial equipment. It is direct, repetitive, and dependent on weather. It also requires patience and attention. Fishermen who work small boats often read the sea for signs, changes in wind, shifts in current, cloud patterns, and bird movement. In late 2012, Alvarenga was working out of the Pacific coast of Mexico, near the town of Costa Azul, in the state of Chiapas. Costa Azul is a small coastal community with a fishing economy. Boats there are typically open skiffs with outboard motors, used for short offshore trips. They are not designed for long-distance travel. They carry limited fuel, limited fresh water, and basic fishing gear. Alvarenga took work as part of a fishing crew in this region. The trip that would become internationally known was not planned as a long voyage. It was a routine commercial outing. The purpose was to catch fish, likely shark and other offshore species, and return within a day. The plan depended on a functioning motor and predictable weather. Another man was assigned to accompany him. His name was Ezequiel Cordoba. In most accounts, Cordoba was younger and less experienced at sea. He was not described as a seasoned fisherman in the same way Alvarenga was. The pairing was practical rather than personal. Small-scale fishing operations often depend on whoever is available, and crews are formed by necessity. The boat they used was a small fiberglass skiff, similar to many boats used along that coastline. It had no cabin and no significant protection from sun or rain. Its safety depended on speed and proximity to shore. If something went wrong close to land, fishermen could sometimes paddle or drift back. If something went wrong farther out, there were few options. Their equipment was basic: fishing lines, hooks, bait, and supplies meant for a short trip. They carried some food and water, but not enough for more than a day or two. There was no reason to pack more. The sea, in this kind of work, was not meant to be a place of extended survival. It was a workplace they expected to leave behind by evening. The region's fishing economy also carried pressure. When a trip was delayed by weather, it meant lost income. When a catch was small, it meant less pay. Decisions were often made quickly, and risks were sometimes accepted because the alternative was returning empty-handed. By November 2012, Alvarenga was a working fisherman in a familiar routine. He was preparing for what should have been a short journey offshore, in waters he had navigated before. The ocean around Chiapas was open and wide, but for fishermen like him, it was also ordinary. The boat left shore with no indication that it would not return. On November 17, 2012, José Salvador Alvarenga and Ezequiel Córdoba departed from the port of Costa Azul in their small skiff. The morning was reported as calm, with light winds and no immediate signs of trouble. The initial route was offshore but within reach of the coast, following the usual path for shark fishing. The expectation was simple: spend a day at sea, catch fish, and return. Within hours, conditions began to change. Weather in the region can shift rapidly. Clouds thickened over the horizon, and gusts of wind began to disturb the otherwise calm waters. Reports and later interviews with Alvarenga indicate that the sea rose unexpectedly, and waves became increasingly difficult to navigate with a small open boat. By the afternoon, the motor began experiencing problems. The engine failed, leaving them without propulsion. Without fuel or functional machinery, the skiff was at the mercy of the ocean's currents. The north equatorial current moves westward, pushing drifting objects toward open waters, away from the coast. Once the engine ceased, returning to shore became impossible. Alvarenga later explained that the storm prevented them from repairing the motor. Attempts were made, but the equipment was damaged beyond temporary fixes. At this point, there was no alternative but to drift. The situation escalated quietly at first. No dramatic panic is recorded. The ocean simply began to carry them farther from land. The horizon widened. The shoreline disappeared. The two men were forced to confront the reality that they were isolated. Without navigation instruments, limited provisions, and an open skiff, the distance to safety increased hourly. They began to understand that the journey they had assumed would last hours could stretch into days. There was no radio contact, no external support, and no immediate path to correction. This moment, when Alvarenga realized that the skiff was no longer controllable, is considered the point of no return. The open Pacific became both workplace and prison. Drift began silently, inexorably, toward the west. From this point onward, survival depended entirely on resourcefulness, adaptation, and endurance. No outside intervention was possible, and the ocean would dictate the limits of their experience. From that day forward, every measure, every decision, was oriented toward sustaining life in a setting where time, space, and weather were indifferent to human needs. Once the skiff began drifting, survival became the only measurable objective. José Salvador Alvarenga and Ezequiel Córdoba faced the Pacific Ocean without fuel, without shelter, and with minimal provisions. The first priority was securing water. Humans can survive for several weeks without food, but only a few days without fresh water. Rainfall provided occasional relief, captured in any available containers. Alvarenga later described collecting water in buckets, cups, and any improvised vessel. During dry periods, they rationed water carefully, consuming only what was necessary to maintain minimal function. Food became the next focus. The ocean, while vast and hostile, also contained sources of sustenance. Alvarenga relied on hand lines to catch fish, primarily small species that could be eaten raw. Occasionally, they caught turtles. Birds, drawn to the boat or exhausted over open water, became intermittent sources of protein. Every catch was preserved minimally, as the boat lacked refrigeration. Salting or sun-drying was impossible. Meals were eaten immediately, raw or freshly killed, providing calories without elaborate preparation. The diet was repetitive and insufficient by conventional standards, but it allowed them to sustain bodily function over time. The sun presented another challenge. Exposure caused dehydration, sunburn, and general fatigue. The small skiff offered no shade. Clothing was limited, and water for washing scarce. Alvarenga used improvised methods: wet cloths to cover the skin, positioning himself and his companion to minimize direct sun exposure when possible. Nights brought cooler temperatures and limited rest, with the rocking of the skiff making sleep fragmented. Despite the discomfort, establishing a basic routine helped maintain physical endurance. Tools were improvised from available resources. Fishing hooks were maintained and sometimes replaced with parts of the boat's equipment. Containers captured rainwater. Lines were used for multiple purposes, from catching fish to securing small items. Even small adjustments, such as arranging the boat to shield from wind or collecting drifting debris for supplemental food, contributed to survival. The logic of using what was immediately available was constant and unrelenting. Daily structure became essential. Alvarenga later described measuring time by natural markers: sunrise, midday, sunset. Tasks were repeated consistently: check lines, inspect provisions, adjust position. The repetition created a framework within the otherwise unmeasurable expanse of ocean. It also supported mental endurance. Small routines, securing water, attempting to catch food, maintaining balance on the skiff, structured each day. They reduced uncertainty, providing control in a situation where external forces were entirely uncontrollable. Mental endurance was intertwined with physical necessity. Isolation stretched indefinitely. Weeks became months. The ocean's monotony was constant, and the horizon offered no change. Alvarenga later described the importance of concentration and focus. Maintaining awareness of lines, the boat's position, and the horizon became exercises in attention. Each lapse could have consequences. The mind was trained to assess continuously, making practical decisions rather than indulging in despair. Interaction with his companion was also part of sustaining survival. Ezequiel Cordoba provided shared effort in fishing and securing water. Cooperation minimized wasted energy and increased chances of success in capturing food. It also helped maintain a measure of social stability, which is critical in extended isolation. Their roles were practical, not emotional. Coordination focused on survival tasks rather than personal communication. Over time, diet and exposure caused physiological changes. Weight loss occurred steadily. Muscle mass declined. Hair and nails reflected malnutrition. Alvarenga later noted that maintaining the act of eating and drinking, even minimal amounts, was a primary measure of progress. Every day that a small meal was secured was a day further from immediate danger. This methodical approach was essential in an environment that offered no reassurance. Navigation, though limited, was also practiced. Without instruments, drift was uncontrolled, but observations of wind, sun, and water currents helped anticipate the skiff's trajectory. Alvarenga noticed the direction of floating debris and the flight of birds. These observations allowed him to estimate proximity to islands, though without precision. Over months, such knowledge helped in decisions about conserving energy, managing food, and preparing for possible landfall. The routine of survival extended into time management. Rest was measured, food preparation was timed, and exposure to sunlight was calculated. Each decision was conservative, intended to maximize the probability of sustaining life rather than achieving any external goal. In this context, improvisation was secondary to repetition. Repeated, disciplined actions, collecting water, fishing, protecting the body, formed the core of their survival strategy. Despite these measures, the environment remained indifferent. Storms occasionally struck, overturning minimal equipment and destroying collected water. Salt accumulated on skin, causing irritation. Heat and cold were constant pressures. Alvarenga later described maintaining resilience by focusing on immediate tasks. Anticipating distant hazards was impossible. Success depended on short-term, observable results: a fish caught, a container filled with water, the body protected from sun. Each task completed was a small victory, though unremarkable and without celebration. As weeks turned into months, physiological adaptation became evident. Alvarenga's body adjusted to the limited diet, consuming mostly raw protein and relying on minimal carbohydrates. Hydration management allowed endurance during dry periods. Fatigue became constant, but manageable within the structure of routine. Mental focus shifted from long-term goals to immediate necessity. Each day was a discrete unit, measured in survival tasks rather than elapsed time. Psychologically, the monotony and scale of the ocean demanded strategies of attention. Alvarenga reported using observation as a method of maintaining sanity, noting wave patterns, wind changes, the position of the sun, and occasional sea life. Concentration on practical tasks prevented a fixation on isolation itself. Reflection on past life or future outcomes was minimal, as it provided no actionable benefit. The structure of daily work became a mental anchor. Over the course of months, the skiff drifted thousands of miles westward, carried by the currents of the Pacific. Food and water were scarce, but never entirely absent. The methods employed, rationing, fishing, collecting rain, shielding from the sun, sustained Alvarenga and his companion. Discipline replaced hope. Routine replaced expectation. The ocean remained vast, unchanging, and indifferent, yet through systematic practice, survival persisted. This period, covering the majority of the journey, was defined not by dramatic events but by continuous adaptation. Each day demanded practical attention. Each failure, whether a lost fish or evaporated water, required immediate correction. The methodical application of simple, repeatable tasks became the framework that allowed survival against extraordinary odds. For 438 days, these measures were repeated with remarkable consistency, shaping the entire experience at sea. As the months progressed, the toll of isolation and minimal sustenance began to manifest more visibly. Both men experienced steady physical decline. Weight loss became pronounced, with Alvarenga later estimating a loss of more than half his body weight. Muscle atrophy and general weakness reduced mobility, making even simple tasks like hauling in a line or adjusting the boat increasingly difficult. Sun exposure left permanent marks on the skin, and salt sores developed where prolonged contact with seawater irritated the body. Malnutrition introduced other risks. Vitamins and minerals were almost entirely absent from their diet. Deficiencies likely contributed to fatigue, weakened immune response, and slower healing from minor injuries. Cuts and abrasions, common on a small, unprotected boat, became more serious over time. Salt water aggravated injuries, and there was no antiseptic or medical support. Illness, though not precisely documented, was inevitable under these conditions, as opportunistic infections and digestive complications emerged. Ezequiel Cordoba, Alvarenga's companion, was affected particularly severely. Accounts suggest that he became weak more rapidly, possibly due to pre-existing health differences or smaller body mass. Over time, he could no longer maintain the labor required to fish, collect water, or protect himself from the elements. He eventually died at sea. The exact date and cause are uncertain, but it was during the early months of drift, before landfall became possible. Alvarenga remained with his companion until the final moments, indicating that death was gradual rather than sudden. The loss of Cordoba left Alvarenga entirely alone. Psychological pressure intensified. The presence of another person, even in silence, had provided a measure of social stability and shared responsibility. Alone, the mental burden increased. The isolation that had been an abstract factor now became concrete. Each task, catching fish, collecting rainwater, adjusting the boat, was performed without assistance. The monotony of ocean and sky became more pronounced, and time blurred further. Days, weeks, and months lost individual identity. Survival became a purely mechanical process: maintain hydration, secure nutrition, protect the body, and rest when possible. Despite these conditions, Alvarenga continued to apply the methods established earlier. Fishing was maintained, even as fatigue made it arduous. Rainwater collection continued, though containers were minimal. He protected his body from sun exposure using whatever clothing or cloth he had left. Meals remained simple, raw, and repetitive. His discipline did not waver, though each success became smaller, measured in minimal calories or a single cup of water. The ocean itself offered no relief. Storms struck unpredictably. Waves sometimes damaged fishing lines or overturned containers of water. Drifting debris occasionally provided supplemental food or shelter, but such incidents were rare. Observation of the sky, wind, and currents remained a constant task, necessary for positioning the boat in a manner that maximized safety and minimized exposure. By this phase, the journey had shifted entirely from work or even accidental drift to survival in its rawest form. The loss of Córdoba marked a psychological turning point. Alvarenga's endurance was no longer supported by cooperation, it depended solely on his ability to maintain routine, manage limited resources, and endure both the physical and mental challenges of solitary drift. Months continued to pass. The distance from land increased, and hope of external rescue diminished. The Pacific remained vast, indifferent, and uncompromising. Each day demanded attention, adaptation, and resilience, while the memory of his companion underscored the human cost of extended isolation at sea. After more than a year adrift, José Salvador Alvarenga reached the edges of the Marshall Islands in early 2014. The approach to land was gradual, unheralded by dramatic storms or sudden sighting of the shore. For months, the skiff had been carried westward by the North Equatorial Current, and the eventual arrival was the result of distance traveled over time rather than a directed course. Alvarenga made landfall on Eben Atoll, a low-lying chain of islands. The atoll is part of the Rawlek Chain, a series of small islands scattered across the western Pacific. Its geography is unremarkable from a distance: sandy beaches, coconut palms, shallow reefs, and sparse human habitation. The arrival did not immediately end the challenge. The atoll's resources were limited, and the isolation of Eben meant that external contact was not guaranteed. Upon landing, Alvarenga sought out the nearest signs of habitation. He encountered local residents, who later reported his appearance as emaciated, weak, and in need of immediate care. His clothing was tattered, his skin marked by sun and salt exposure, and his body reflected the prolonged strain of deprivation. Medical attention was provided, and officials began the process of verifying his account. Alvarenga's survival was met with skepticism at first. Authorities and journalists questioned the feasibility of drifting 438 days across the Pacific in a small skiff. Subsequent investigations confirmed his story through interviews, local observations, and corroborating details about the boat, route, and equipment used. While precise details of daily experience remained unverifiable, the overall account was consistent with known ocean currents, survival physiology, and maritime drift patterns. The arrival was quiet and factual. There was no immediate celebration or dramatic rescue sequence. Alvarenga's endurance had concluded with a slow, measured transition from open water to land. He was removed from the ocean environment, provided with basic sustenance, and his condition documented. The ordeal that had lasted more than a year ended in practical, observable terms rather than heroic spectacle. The Marshall Islands, remote yet inhabited, offered the final stage of the drift. The ocean had been indifferent, carrying him across thousands of miles. Landfall provided closure, not triumph. Alvarenga survived through the methodical application of minimal resources, persistent routine, and disciplined attention to immediate survival tasks. The journey of José Salvador Alvarenga remains one of the longest recorded instances of human survival at sea. It is not a story of heroics or spectacle, but of methodical endurance under the strictest limitations. Drifted by currents, nourished by rain and small catches, he demonstrated the practical application of survival principles over an extended period in an environment unconcerned with human need. His experience also provides a reference point for understanding physiological adaptation, mental discipline, and the consequences of prolonged isolation. Alvarenga's survival confirms that consistent routines, resource management, and attention to immediate necessity can sustain life under conditions that appear unsurvivable. The Pacific Ocean, vast and indifferent, carried him across thousands of miles. In the quiet of Eben Atoll, the significance lies not in drama, but in the continuity of life maintained through observation, discipline, and adaptation. The record of 438 days at sea stands as a testament to human endurance in its most restrained and factual form.